Hello everyone, I am Pastor Wright, and today I would like to begin something with you. It is a Stewardship Bible study, and we'll do it online or we'll do it through this video recording, and it is found on the LCMS website, and I will put a link in the comments below. But it is the Stewardship Basics, and we're going to go through session 1 and see how things go. So please feel free to contact me with any questions or anything that you learned or want to know more. So the first statement about stewardship basics is, what is stewardship and what are we to do with it? And this is really important for us to understand as we continue with our strategic planning, and just generally and basically with the life of the church and the individual Christian, because we need to remember that we have been gifted with everything in our lives, and this will come out in the midst of the Bible study. So we have the introduction, and I'd like to just read that to you quickly. Stewardship, it's a topic that rarely provokes a neutral reaction. It either brings disdain because it makes those who hear the message uncomfortable, or it promotes a legalism that is not true to the scriptures. Neither reaction is godly. To arrive at the desired destination, one needs to begin at the proper place. Stewardship Basics, the Bible study that we're going to go through, endeavors to do this. It starts with the Creator. Not the steward. To show that stewardship is a journey that begins with identity. From creation, human beings were tasked with the stewardship of all that the Lord God has made. But this stewardship was not left to the will and whim of man. Instead, being created in the image of God, the steward is to reflect the owner's will in every aspect of his or her stewardship. Stewards can be good, but because of the first stewardship crisis of Genesis chapter 3, all stewardship is flawed. Usurping the role of the Creator, sinful stewards claimed ownership of what was not theirs. The result was judgment. This judgment did not excuse the steward from his or her created purpose. It only made stewardship an unpleasant labor. But in the blessedness of the gospel, the steward is redeemed and set free to reflect the image of the Creator and Redeemer. Stewardship that begins in the right place can, by the leading of the Holy Spirit through the gospel, produce an understanding of stewardship that is liberating. The desired result is faithfulness. This study is the central piece of the major applied project of the Reverend Dr. Metter's Doctor of Ministry degree. It is presented here to help congregations find the correct starting point for a renewed discussion of who God has created and redeemed his stewards to be for him. It is not intended to be a comprehensive study, but rather it is a starting point to frame an ongoing effort in stewardship. Hopefully those using it will find it to be very helpful in starting a discussion for whole life stewardship that seeks to promote faithfulness. To God be the glory. And it is already set up here in the introduction that this is all about God's gifts to us and how we receive, how we respond, and how we use. And I like the language of participating. We get to participate in God's creation. We get to participate in God's work. And we do this by being stewards. Okay. So then we go into the first question, and this is getting started. And I like this. So the first question is, when you hear the word stewardship, what comes to mind? And I thought about this. and it's actually nothing good. I think of money. I think of fundraisers. I think of those cards, those pledge cards. I think of awkwardness, the awkwardness of talking about money, talking about finance. I also think personal. Who am I to talk about your money, your finances? And then the awkwardness of fundraisers, fund drives, and all those things. So for me, just coming from the pastoral perspective, we get a lot of awkwardness in these words, but that's just free word association. What words come to mind when you think of the word stewardship? And then the second question in this study is, as you look at the words, and the words that you thought of that were generated and the free association, do you find them to be topics that you would like to talk about, to have further discussion? Do you want to talk about money? Do you want to talk about finances? Do you want to talk about fund drives, pledge cards, all those things? What other terms or thoughts came up as you heard word association for stewardship? And again, this is to help us think beyond just the normal stuff. Again, I immediately think of money, and stewardship, as you know, is so much bigger than that. So then this is question 3. What is a steward? And the answer, the steward, is an only Old English word derived from the term sty, S-T-Y, dash, warden, W-A-R-D-E-N. The work of a sty warden was to manage the ruler's meat supply. I think that's interesting. This was the word that the translators of the King James Version chose to render the Greek oikomias. And the Greek noun comes from the root word oikomeia, which means household. The Greek concept is the one which we derive the word economy. A steward is one who manages or administers someone else's household affairs. He or she is a trustee or an agent for the benefit of the owner. A steward is the one who does the work of stewardship. The steward is the one who manages someone else's household. This is especially true of the Christian, as we have been called to manage the household affairs of the world for the sake of the true owner, our God. We learn more about ownership in session 2. What is unique that there is no one word for steward or stewardship in the Hebrew. While the vocabulary words do not exist, some of the greatest examples of stewards and stewardship that become formative for us as Christian stewards are found in the Old Testament. So stewardship in reality is really nothing other than managing something that belongs to someone else. So you have stuff, materials, resources that you manage, that you use, that don't belong to you. And so the steward is the one who does the managing. To be a steward is like being the foreman on a ranch. The foreman isn't the owner. The rancher is the owner. The foreman is responsible to and for the ranch and is accountable to the rancher. And I like that imagery. You get to work for the benefit of the owner, but you use what has been given to you to do that. So then question 4. Have you ever considered your role as a steward of God's creation in this way? Why or why not? It is important to use this and similar analogy in the teaching of stewardship because it really is such a foreign concept to many. even those within Holy Cross, so the local congregation. And I thought of this very interesting, because when we think about our stuff, we think about we own it. It is ours. It is our possessions. And so we start thinking about what and who we are as possessors. But we need to realize everything has been gifted to us. Even our own bodies. We have been gifted with body. We have been gifted with reason. We have been gifted with all these things. How do you view yourself as steward? The one who uses, the one who manages your body, your mind, your thoughts, your words, your actions, your stuff, your money, your fill in the blank. And this really changes our perspective, because again, especially in the whole idea of the consumer idea of our culture, we are to consume, we are to gather, we are to collect, we are to have. But when we think about this, do we really in fact own anything? Is this really ours? And I like this, because now this changes our responsibility. It changes our identity, because it's not about just collecting stuff. It's not just about he who has the most toys at the end wins. What do we do with this? Why do we have this stuff? And why and how are we to use these things? Okay, so again, please think about this. And if you have any comments, put them in, and we will have a further discussion of what it is to think of ourselves as stewards of creation, of resources, of the things that God has given to us. Okay, so question number 5. What claim does this definition make on one who is to be a faithful steward? And I love this question. So, not reading the answer, but it puts us in our right position, our right place. We are put in our place by God. So in creation, God creates everything. And I love this. He speaks things into creation. Let there be light. Let there be oceans. Let there be seas. Let there be land. Let there be trees, birds, fish. And all of it just happens because he says so. And then he stops speaking, and he creates man and woman, Adam and Eve, and puts them in the garden. And then he places them as stewards of all creation. They literally, like you and me, become co-creators. And what I mean by that is God has given us all this stuff, creation, that we continue creating, we continue making, but we use his resources, his gifts of creation to further God's creation, to continue to do his work of creating. We create things to make our lives easier, to help our lives, to benefit our neighbor. And that is what it is, in part, to be a steward. But notice that creates an identity. We now become participants in creation. We become participants, and I love this, in God's work. We're not to abuse God's creation. We're not to misuse God's creation, but utilize them for the benefit of our neighbor. We are to help. We are to build up him or her and to utilize God's gifts in that. And again, this helps us to understand our connection to God and then our connection to one another. How are we good stewards of the very gifts that God lays out for us? Okay, so then we move into question 6. In what way does the working definition move beyond considering stewardship only from a financial perspective? And the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod actually has a definition for stewardship. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod defines stewardship as the free, and I like this, joyous activity of the child of God and God's family, the church, in managing all of life and life's resources for God's purposes. And again, this puts us in a great position. We get to know our relationship with God, and we get to know our relationship with one another. Okay, so again, question 6. In what way does this working definition move beyond considering stewardship only from a financial perspective? Now, again, when we think of stewardship, how quickly do you figure out ways to protect your wallet? And we see from this God's purpose for our life, God's purpose for our family. How do we use his resources for all that he has given to us? And this is so much more than just money. Now, money is important, and it is part of all of this, but we see very quickly how this goes so far beyond just monetary, financial money. It goes on, how do we use God's gifts of creation, all of creation, our bodies, our thoughts, our time, our relationships. And we see quickly that it is everything that God says or God gives to us. So there isn't anything that is not included in the call of the steward. As we will discuss in the next session, in the creation account, everything belongs to God. Nothing belongs to me. Nothing belongs to you. And so with that, again, it puts us in this wonderful position to receive and to participate, to receive and to give. And we get to look to God for all of this. Okay, so question 7. How does this definition match with your personal attitude and understanding of stewardship in your life? Now, again, when we did the free association, you heard what I said. It was really about money. It was about fundraising and pledge cards and all the things that we or I immediately associated. And when we talk about the proper place of being a steward and stewardship, we see that it is so much more, and it changes. And I like the idea that it becomes a joyful life of participating and utilizing God's gifts. And we need to think about this in such a bigger way, because we have the gifts of God, not to hold and hide, not to hoard, but to use, to build, to help, to sustain, to grow, to support our neighbor, to serve. And I really like that service language. We are literally partnering with God. Now, God does the lion's share of all the work. He does all the work for our salvation. But then when we have this gift of creation, he says, guys, my people, my children, here is everything. Use them. Eat, drink, live, support, build, and do all that you need for this life and the life of your family, the life of the neighbor, the life of the stranger. All of this is now for you, for your benefit. Now again, he's the owner, but giving and bestowing upon us. So that was question 7. And then we move into this other part, or this other aspect, and this is stewardship standards. A steward manages the possessions and affairs of someone else, but this stewardship is not without standards. And the Bible study is directing us to read 1 Corinthians chapter 4, and I'll read that to you real quick. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. And I really like that word, faithful. But with me, it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you, or even by any human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I am not aware of anything against myself, but I am not thereby acquitted. It is the Lord who judges me. This is how one should regard us, as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. And again, that is 1 Corinthians 4, verses 1 through 2. And so those are the standards in which St. Paul lays out for us. So question 8. What is the standard that the Lord, through his servant Paul, sets for the work of steward? Now, when we hear this in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, we hear the being stewards of the mysteries of God. And that's what your pastor does. He stewards the mysteries of God. That is word and sacrament. That is the word of God, that's preaching. And then that is the administering the Lord's Supper and baptism. But then in
power off.
But then in verse 2, we hear it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. Your pastor should be found faithful, but you are also a steward. You're a steward of God's gifts, creations, and resources, and you are to be found faithful. The answer in the Bible class or the Bible study says, while Paul in this setting is clearly speaking of pastors and the mysteries of the gospel, it is not to be lost that the expectation of the master, God, the Lord, a faithful steward is one who has proven that he or she is worthy of the trust of the master. And frankly, that's a scary statement, to be asked, are you worthy to be a faithful steward, to steward the gifts of your master? And I hear this and I'm terrified. Am I good enough to steward the gifts of my wife, of my children, of my money, of whatever? And we have to remember, all these things are gifted to us, and we are to steward them. We are to manage them, use them correctly and appropriately, so for the glory of God, for the gifts and the work and the participation of this life. We move into question 9. What might the faithful steward look like in the 21st century? That's a great question. The answer that is printed, the basic form of stewardship is daily work. And I like that. No matter what the work may be, another good place to look for what stewardship looks like in our times today is in Luther's Small Catechism. The Table of Duties is a great place to start. It deals with every aspect of life. It also has a grand construction. It radiates out from the font, altar, and pulpit, from the pastors to the hearers and beyond. The various words from the Lord about the call of the steward are clear and plentiful. And I love Luther's Small Catechism and the Table of Duties, because you hear what the pastor is supposed to do. You hear what the hearer is supposed to do, what the husband is to do, the wife is supposed to do, what the father is to do, what the mother is supposed to do, what the children are supposed to do, what the neighbor is supposed to do. And we see that everything radiates from who and what we are in our vocational life, where God has placed us to serve and to live. So I encourage you to review your small catechism and remember where you are in your life. Where has God put you? And what do the tables of duty lay out to you? So, question 10. What is the mark of the faithful manager in the words of Jesus? And we get to see this from the text, St. Luke chapter 12. And that will tell us that we get to be reminded of our place in and through what God gives to us. And again, that's St. Luke chapter 12, verses 41 through 48. Peter said, Lord, are you telling this parable for us or for all? And the Lord said, who then is the faithful and the wise manager, who is his master, will set over his household to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is the servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, my master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male or female servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant who knew his master's will, but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much is given of him, much will be required. And from him to him they entrusted much. They will demand the more. And it is right there that we get to see that not only has God gifted us all these great and wondrous gifts, but we are to be about his work, utilizing his gifts, because he is going to return. And this is actually not a law statement, but how do you desire to be found when Jesus comes back? Abusing the gifts that God has given to you, or utilizing and being a faithful steward of the gifts that God has laid before you? And this is the mission of the church. This is the life of a faithful steward, to be giving, utilizing, and holding on to the gifts that God gives to you for the benefit of the neighbor and the glory of God. And so again, that is a huge statement coming from Jesus. Question 11. What happens when the master finds the servant doing what he or she was supposed to be doing when he returns? Jesus makes it clear that the response is blessing. But notice that that blessing does not mean material wealth. What it does mean is even greater responsibility. And then question 12. What are the marks of a unfaithful servant? The unfaithful servant is one who is seeking not after the master's interest, but rather his own comforts. In this he abdicates. He lets go his role as steward, that is servant, and assumes the role of owner. The slaves, the possessions, do not ever change hands in ownership. The actions of the unfaithful stewards do not change the status of the steward to that of owner. Just because I, you, or anybody else acts as the unfaithful steward, and this actually becomes a first commandment issue, we act as if we own everything. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means that we are abusing our position, and we're abusing the gifts and the responsibility that has been given to us. So what are the consequences that befalls the steward who is caught by surprise when the master returns? The servant caught unaware will receive the most severe of beatings. This serves as a great warning for all those engaged in the act of stewardship. We do not know when the Master will return. We do know that the Master, our Lord Jesus, will come again. We are simply to be about, I love this, the daily task of serving Him by serving our neighbor. And you've heard that before. So, question 14. What are modern day rewards and consequences for faithful and unfaithful stewards today? This is no indication that if we are unfaithful in our stewardship, that we will gain worldly wealth. In fact, as you read this section, it never implies that we will become wealthy if we are faithful to the Lord. What faithfulness will bring is an ever-increasing trust from the Master to be about the service of the Lord as we serve our neighbors. However, unfaithfulness to stewardship matters does have consequences. The greatest consequence can come from the fact that our poor stewardship can threaten our relationship with the Lord Himself. As a result, stewardship is not a take it or leave it proposition. It is an expectation that we will take our entire life. We are expected to be good stewards. We are expected to use our Master's gifts and resources for our lives and the lives that God has placed into our care. And we need to, again, look at this. What is it to be faithful? That is to trust in God and to utilize and use His gifts. What does it mean to be unfaithful? That is to misuse our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, and His gifts. And this is question 15. To whom are we ultimately accountable as stewards today? And we are ultimately accountable to God. He has gifted you with everything. He has gifted you with life. And you will be accountable to Him for what you have done. And we need to remember this. And it helps us to put this in perspective, because we have a good and gracious God who abundantly gives. But how do we use it? And what work do we use it for? So in the next section for this, it's the biblical examples of faithful and unfaithful stewards. And it is from Genesis chapter 39 and Genesis 41. And this is Joseph. Joseph, as you know, was sold into slavery, and he ends up becoming Pharaoh's right-hand man. And the questions that are asked are, who is the faithful steward in this text? And of course, it's Joseph, because we see that Joseph doesn't take the position of Pharaoh. Pharaoh turns over literally all of Egypt to him and says, manage this for me. Joseph at no time thinks of himself higher than Pharaoh, but faithfully, for the benefit of Pharaoh and the benefit of all the people who live in Egypt, he becomes a good steward, managing the resources of Egypt, the resources that Pharaoh gives. And well, how did he show his faithfulness? And again, he doesn't usurp Pharaoh, but he manages the gifts, manages the resources that Egypt has. And this is all about the famine that is coming to prepare during the good years so that they can survive the lean years or through the famine. So this is question 18. What were some of the rewards for his faithfulness? Well, he gets out of jail. He serves Pharaoh, but he also gets to serve God's people. And he also gets to utilize what God has bestowed upon him. And so then this is question 19. Were there always rewards for his faithfulness? And this is a very important question. When Joseph acts rightly, goodly, godly, he doesn't always get rewarded for his faithfulness. You have other people working against him. Remember Potiphar's wife, who accuses him of trying to have sex with him, with her. Potiphar's wife accuses him of sexual immorality, and he is thrown in prison, even though he does the right thing. So we see that his faithfulness is not always rewarded. And then when we look at Genesis 41, and this is when Pharaoh has the dream, and Joseph gets to interpret it, and Pharaoh sees who Joseph is. Question 20 is, in what way was the faithfulness of Joseph's stewardship rewarded here? And think about this. He wakes up in the morning a prisoner, and by the end of the night, he is Pharaoh's second in command. He is Pharaoh's right-hand guy. So that's really good. And this was a long time coming. Joseph was in prison for quite some time, and he prayed to God, but he trusted God would provide and would rescue him and see him through all things. So question 21. How does this stewardship eventually end up saving the very people who put Joseph into slavery? And we hear that Joseph's brothers go to Egypt because there's food, there's resources. And Joseph does not hold it against his brothers that they sold him into slavery. In fact, we hear that Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant evil by your actions, but in God's good plans, he used your evil actions actually for your good." And so he brings his family to Goshen, and he is able to serve them by providing for them in the work of his stewardship of Pharaoh, of Egypt's resources. And so we see the faithfulness, and we see how Joseph was able to be a good steward. And then the last questions will be about the parable of the dishonest manager or steward. And this comes to us from St. Luke chapter 16. And we find out that this steward or manager has been unfaithful in managing his master's resources. And he realizes he's going to be fired. So he calls all the people who owe his master money or has a debt, and he changes their bills and changes what they owe. And he's trying to gain friendship, or he's trying to help himself in this. And the first question is, how is the manager, the steward, held accountable? Well, because he's not doing a good job, his boss, the master, is going to fire him. But then question 23, what were the consequences of his unfaithful stewardship? Well, he's losing his job, and he goes out of his way to make for himself friends with his master's vendors, or the ones that he does business with. And then question 24, what are the consequences of our unfaithful stewardship today? And I think this is a really good question, because this is about relationships. This is about money. This is about your work, all the things that have been given to you. What are the consequences when you misuse the things that have been placed into your life? And the answer that the Bible study provides, The consequences of our unfaithful stewardship today takes many forms. If we are unfaithful stewards of our bodies, we can become ill. If we are unfaithful in our finances, we could lose our home. If we are unfaithful with our stewardship of our marriage, it can cause divorce. If we are unfaithful with our parenting, we can allow our children to adopt destructive habits. The list is nearly endless. Okay, well, that is the last question of this section. And as we move on, we will continue to discuss the basics of stewardship, but specifically from what Scripture says, and in our connection and relationship with God and one another. I thank you for your patience, as this is the first go around for this recording. So please leave comments or email me with your thoughts or questions as we, as a congregation, continue to look at what is stewardship and how we can be faithful stewards in all of what God gives to us.